What?
This is not Overwatch. Well, not the game that got me hooked back in the heyday of 2017. The main balance and design philosophy is currently centered around the official 1-2-2 role distribution paradigm, each team consisting of 1 tank, 2 damage, and 2 support heroes. It's been rough. Many would attest to the stranglehold that sniper heroes currently have over the playing experience of the entire hero roster. The off-tanking role no longer exists, and tank players are more than ever resigned to a rock-paper-scissors dynamic of hero counter-swapping. This transition towards the 1-2-2 role queue format for the sequel has gone anything but smooth, but it was likely a response to circumstances in the later stages of Overwatch 1's lifespan, where queue times had skyrocketed for all but tank players, becoming a bottleneck for the original 2-2-2 role queue ecosystem, a symptom of the poor playing experience of tank heroes at the time. Advocates for the 5v5 solo tank format were keen that the new 1-2-2 role queue distribution would resolve the double barrel meta that had plagued the original Overwatch right till its dying days. By barring the use of multiple tank heroes, each tank hero could then be hypothetically balanced without accounting for the presence of a second tank, and thus there was potential to buff tank heroes to make them less individually fragile, and therefore improve the tank gameplay experience by bridging the gap between said gameplay experience and the power fantasy of the role, while not being detrimental to the metagame as a whole. Well, that was the idea, not how it panned out. The 1-2-2 role queue format was supposed to solve problems, not create more problems than it would solve. Negative sentiments towards the live format has only since solidified as more content creators speak out against the current format of the game. With this hindsight in mind, was the shift to the 5v5 1-2-2 role queue format a mistake? Before making any definitive statements on this dilemma, we ought to revisit the intentions for the implementation of the role queue system as a whole.
The reason we are adding role queue is because we believe that it's going to improve match quality. It's going to give you more control over your play experience. You're going to have more options as to what you're going to play. And it's also going to relieve a lot of the social pressure that some of us feel and overall create a better social experience for us when picking our heroes and picking our roles.
The intended benefits of the role queue system can be summed up here as a major quality of life improvement to the matchmaking and hero selection process of each Overwatch match, as the conversation steers clear of intricacies in hero balance and the metagame. Jeff himself corroborates this soon in the same developer update.
I want to dispel any misconception that the reason that we are implementing this feature is to change the meta. We are not at all. In fact, we're in the middle of a big meta shift anyway that's happening very naturally through hero balance. We don't believe that a rule like this is intended to target any one specific meta. There will always be a meta, there will always be some level of dissatisfaction with a meta, and we would never make a rule change like this targeted at a specific meta. It's also not our goal to control the meta.
But I would argue there are reasons to doubt the sincerity of this insistence. This isn't the first time that the Overwatch team would issue a statement of questionable integrity, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. The meta back then in the highest tiers of play, most notably within the Overwatch League, was that of a composition consisting of 3 tank, 3 support, and 0 damage heroes, also known as the GOATS meta. Remember, at the time there were no limits to the number of heroes per role that could be played in a team. There was immense pressure from both viewers and participants of the league to resolve the GOATS meta, as the lack of compositional variety and the absence of the damage role in the league had rendered both the viewing and playing experience of Overwatch at the highest tiers of play a stale affair. And so it was certainly coincidental that the 2-2-2 role limit format would directly tackle and squash the dominance of the 3-3 composition.
I get to play DPS again, woo!
This very conversation on enforcing a role limit format in the Overwatch League is a red flag itself. If the implementation of the role queue system was truly intended to be a quality of life improvement to the miscellaneous processes of matchmaking and hero selection in an uncoordinated Overwatch environment, independent from the direction of hero balance and the metagame, why would the role limit be implemented into the Overwatch League in the first place? Woes of being unwillfully pressured into playing a support hero with 5 other damage heroes in the team, or skill mismatches between players in a role-indiscriminate matchmaking system, are completely irrelevant in the Overwatch League. Players in the Overwatch League are not spontaneously subjected into playing heroes or roles they didn't sign up for during the first 40 seconds of any match. Every team is pre-made, and so the conversation of matchmaking was never in the domain of the league in the first place. The only impact that implementing such a role limit format onto the highest competitive stage there is would be to shape the metagame itself, at a most timely fashion nonetheless.
It's also not our goal to control the meta.
Actions speak louder than words. In the same developer update, Jeff would go on as follows.
With a 2-2-2 composition, it's going to change how we have to balance the heroes. It's not going to be easier to balance the heroes, it's not going to be more difficult to balance the heroes. It's just different.
Except it isn't. Not if the developers were fully transparent with what they had hoped to accomplish with the role queue format. If the scope of the role queue system was truly confined to simply
Give you more control over your play experience,
why would any pitched quality of life improvement affect hero balance of all things, which in turn defines the metagame? If players were to be empowered with having
more options as to what you're going to play,
why was the option to queue for open queue competitive removed from the game with the introduction of the role queue format, only to be reinstated 10 months late after the launch of the role queue system in August of 2019? And while granted, the open queue format had remained accessible for the entire duration under the guise of Quick Play Classic in the Arcade tab, relegating the classic open queue format to an arcade mode minus a competitive format, in conjunction with the recognition of the 2-2-2 role limit format as the official game mode in the Overwatch League, would cement the death of competitive legitimacy in the open queue format, its player base, and most importantly, grant the developers the authority to balance Overwatch solely under the 2-2-2 role distribution paradigm, thus delegitimizing team compositions that would otherwise pose as balancing challenges for the Overwatch team, and therefore alleviating an exponential amount of work otherwise required to balance the game in an open queue environment. Well, the Overwatch team had intended to dispel the misconception that hero balance and the metagame had any influence in the implementation of the role queue system. Both the execution of this implementation into the live game then, and especially the full adoption of the format into the Overwatch League, would tell a very different story. Had role queue simply been an additional option on top of the pre-existing quick play and competitive modes, and not an outright replacement, the Overwatch team would have accomplished the goals laid out in their developer update. But through their actions by contrast, it is not a far-fetched understanding today that the 2-2-2 role queue system was implemented in big part as an in-game balancing and meta moderation effort. I think this is a crucial understanding to grasp as we dive into Overwatch 2's transition into the 1-2-2 role queue format. Most existing players today look fondly towards the role queue system upon its induction, accepting the change of rule sets as a valid balancing measure for the game. However, keep in mind there is very likely a survivorship bias at play here, as fans of the prior competitive open queue format would have had 10 months to have already left this community, with minimal to no incentives to revisit the Overwatch IP since. Which brings us to Overwatch 2. There is a glaring similarity between the transition towards Overwatch 2's 1-2-2 role queue format today versus the transition towards the original role queue format itself back in 2019. Overwatch's competitive timeline can be defined by 3 major phases, each with their own role distribution paradigm, and for each phase, the end stage would be marked by a stale meta, with a general consensus of notable problematic hero designs being attributed for the cause of said meta. Given the favorable reception in the implementation of the 2-2-2 role queue format back in 2019, I am not entirely surprised by the shift towards the 1-2-2 role distribution format. There is precedence that reformatting the role distribution in the game is largely an accepted balancing measure. If the 2-2-2 role queue format was an acceptable solution to the GOATS meta back in 2019, why wouldn't the 1-2-2 format be just an acceptable solution to the problem of the double barrier meta? The live format simply follows the template that the initial 2-2-2 implementation had laid out, that it is appropriate to solve meta imbalances by changing the rules of the game. Perhaps the flaws of this methodology are more apparent today, as while attempting to resolve the double barrel meta and any defense ability rotation and stacking possibilities, the developers took a dual-pronged approach by both reformatting the game away from having multiple tanks, while also reworking Orisa's abilities to no longer facilitate such a dynamic. Thus, it has become more apparent and common to argue that had Orisa been reworked similarly in a 2-2-2 environment, that it would have already resolved the double barrel meta nonetheless. The issue had truly stemmed from hero designs with stacking ability synergies all along. I implore that we take this revelation and apply it to the initial implementation of the role queue format altogether. If the developers had the prime intention of implementing the role queue system to resolve the GOAT's meta, perhaps the issue had not stemmed from the open queue format itself, but in the problematic hero designs that exist even today. Brigitte had received the most vitriol in this aspect, but there was already an overall hero design crisis with the entire tank and support hero roster, with the sheer number of defenses and sustainability that stacking heroes from these two categories would provide. The introduction of the 222 role queue format did not isolate and resolve any of these problems. In fact, I would argue that for as much as the 222 format would neuter the potency of such problematic tank and support hero designs, the format had also concealed the core hero design problem, and thus enabling the developers to continue designing heroes of this similar problematic vein. And this is demonstrated no better than with the release of Sigma. As the fourth barrier tank added to the roster then, it is no coincidence that Sigma was released in the same patch that had introduced the 222 role queue system. Sigma possesses the most flexible barrier ability in the game, and had this hero been introduced into an official open queue competitive format, it would have spelt disaster for further exacerbating the dominant GOAT's meta at the time. Even with the 222 format in place, it ultimately led to the proliferation of the double barrier meta, the consequence of a poor hero design philosophy in the development team that is seemingly not keen to hold itself accountable on designing hero abilities that don't result in needlessly reiterating and overlapping on already existing abilities. This poor hero design philosophy should be addressed at its core, without the cover or leniencies that a 222 or 122 role queue format would provide. If there should be a definitive statement about whether Overwatch 2's shift towards the 5v5 122 role queue format was a mistake, this would apply not just to the recent shift but to the usage of the role queue system as a whole since 2019 as a balancing measure. It is 100% a mistake to implement role queue as a quasi-solution for faulty hero designs, hero balancing, or to moderate any particular meta, all of which have led to negative repercussions in the live game that were otherwise entirely avoidable. That is not to say that a role queue system should never have been implemented, but it should have stayed in lane of being a quality of life queue option, and not declared as the one and only official way to play Overwatch competitively, masquerading as a solution to the core problematic hero design issues at hand. The Overwatch team cannot run away from this problem forever. They should be better than this.
Yeah, I think this next slide says it all.
Ultimately, it is about heroes.
Over the years, both the developers and the community have become so radically obsessed with the subject of roles in Overwatch that it's almost forgotten as to why Overwatch is such a compelling title in the first place. The footage here is what Jeff Kaplan had to say about roles in Overwatch back in 2014.
The roles in Overwatch are very loosely defined at best, so when I talk about the offense role or the defense role, really those characters are interchangeable and can play in other roles. The roles kind of exist to just more help you as a player identify, like, well, what type of character, or what's the type of play style I'm in.
For a long time in Overwatch history, heroes were designed to be heroes first, and then classified into a role serving merely as a soft recommendation for players. Role identities of heroes were never meant to strictly dictate what individual heroes could offer. This is most apparent with heroes like Symmetra and Sombra, whose role identities are frequently debated between whether they should be damage or support heroes. And these conversations typically steer towards the idea of reworking their existing kits to better align their capacities towards what is deemed appropriate for the aforementioned roles. But the reason why these heroes are compelling to begin with has nothing to do with their capacities to fit the bill of any role. Symmetra does not strictly do damage or support hero things. She does her own brand of Symmetra things. Sombra does not strictly do damage or support hero things. She hacks things. Roles as a whole do not accurately represent the identities of Overwatch heroes, and they shouldn't have to, as the diversity of heroes on display, not roles, is ultimately the selling point of the title.
You know, the world could always use more heroes.
And heroes, not roles, were what I signed up for back in 2017. But under this mantra, the last thing that comes to mind is for a team to say they don't need you because they already have a tank, and Blizzard classified your hero as a tank. What is more ironic than having this be the official standard of play for a game that could always use more heroes?
No.